Hi, everyone. My name is Emily, and my pronouns are she, her. And I am going to be hosting this panel along with Julia. And I'll pass along to Julia for a quick intro.
Yeah. Hey everyone. I'm Giulia, and my pronouns are she, her. I'm really excited about this panel, so I'll definitely already start to pass it over to maybe Anandita.
Hi, I'm Anandita. I go by pronoun she, her. I'm currently based in India and I work as a conversation designer at a mental health app. And I studied psychology and transitioned to design a couple years ago.
Awesome. Kaine, you want to go next?
Hi, my name is Kaine Darnell, and I work in conversational AI. I was a psychology professor for 20 years before I transitioned into industry, and my pronouns are they, them.
Olivia?
Hello, my name is Olivia Marrese. I am currently a senior conversation designer at Quick, based in Seattle. I received a PhD in linguistics from the University of Colorado. Yes, we have another PhD in linguistics on the panel today, so super excited to be talking with you all.
Thanks for being here. Tim?
Yeah, hi everyone, I'm Tim. My pronouns are he, him. I'm the head of conversation design for Nibble, which is a negotiating chatbot. So as you can imagine, crammed full of behavioral science. I've been there for about 3 years, and I came into conversation design from a copywriting background.
Awesome. Well, thank you. I guess I forgot to introduce the panel first before doing intros. So we're going to be talking about the intersection between behavioral science and conversational AI. And I think we'll just get right into the questions since there's a lot to cover, and I'm really excited for this discussion. So the first question I have is, what is behavioral science? And I'm going to maybe, Kaine, do you want to start?
Well, when I think about behavioral science, I think about issues around reinforcement and punishment, basically getting people to behave the way you want them to behave in a certain context. When I think about behavioral psychology, I think about interrogating all of that in terms of being's consciousness. So when I want to distinguish between behavioral science and behavioral psychology, I think, can you really ask the person what their experience is about and get them to give you feedback? So if we're just, I mean, really behavioral science is about manipulating people and getting them to do what you want. And behavioral psychology is understanding why they want to do what you want them to do.
Tim or Olivia, go ahead.
I would say, yeah, you saw that pre-beginning. I would also say from my perspective, from a few other fields' perspective, I think of behavioral science in slightly a more broad term of what are humans doing? What do we want them to be doing? What do they want to be doing? Essentially. And particularly, I come from a subfield called conversation analysis that looks at how interaction functions. What do people want to do and get done via conversation? So certainly that's awesome. Just saw that Kaine, I think this is chat everyone can see from Boulder originally. So I take a slightly different tact, not from the psychology side so much, but in terms of interactionally, what are people doing? What are the behaviors that they're exhibiting? And then, especially in our case, and for this panel today, how can we design experiences that align with those kind of behaviors, and or in that design, nudge folks the way we want them to go?
And I think to take a more optimistic view of less manipulating people in conversational AI, I think we can use it as a means of helping people stay on the happy path of our conversation and kind of keeping them on track and not veering off course. So it is still getting someone to do what you want, but also making sure they have a good experience with AI, because you need to kind of hold someone's hand a bit. And I think this helps us do that.
Yeah, I agree with what everybody said. And because I recently studied psychology, it reminds me of the behavioral psychology and conditioning aspects, but also the part about learned behavior and learning through your environment. So when you think of behavioral psychology, how are people learning what they are learning? Is it from people in their area? Is it family? All of those factors are also something I think about when I think about people's behavior, as opposed to what we want our users or people to do.
So I'm curious how each of you have kind of applied behavioral science or behavioral psychology to the work that you're doing. And if there are any specific techniques that you used, or if there are any maybe specific to conversational AI as well. So maybe Tim, you want to start?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, we have a lot of behavioral science like techniques in Nibble because we're negotiating with people day in, day out, handling like 30,000 negotiations a month. And a lot of a successful negotiation comes down to understanding stuff like this and how you can get someone to a kind of win-win deal that they're happy with and they feel like they haven't lost out. So we have a professor of behavioral science on our board of senior advisors who has given a great TED talk about some negotiation techniques in the past. And we will show him, we'll find like transcripts of a real user who's negotiated pretty well with Nibble. And we'll show him this and say, right, how would this go if this was human and human negotiating? Like, what is the ideal outcome in this conversation? And then we'll look at what he suggests and try and incorporate that kind of stuff into our chatbot to help us agree more deals. So one example that came really early on with Nibble is we used to open up conversations and just say, oh, hi, I want to find you a better price for this. What would you offer for it? And leave it open-ended. And then we thought about putting anchoring into Nibble. And anchoring is where the first piece of information you give out in a negotiation, the first number that's mentioned, anchors the whole rest of the discussion around that number. So now we make sure Nibble goes first, anchors the discussion around a particular discount or price point, and that kind of sets expectations for a customer and what they should expect to agree a deal at. So they don't just jump in at $10 offers for a $1,000 bag. And when we did that, when we put in anchoring, we noticed that our rate of agreeing deals went up by 20% very quickly. So it was a big success, something small like that. Yeah.
Anyone else?
I love that you said small like that because it seems small, but it's actually not small at all when you're seeing a 20% increase in success. And really, you know, we said, Tim, about looking at the data, seeing what people are doing, looking to the science to see if you can do it better. I mean, that's essentially the trajectory that I think we all follow in our designing and build process. So like something that I do in more of an applied sense, one example of that is preference structure in question design. And so certain kinds of questions prefer certain kinds of answers. So something like a do you want X is going to prefer a yes or no response compared to an open-ended question or open-ended response. There's all these different kind of types and categories that have different pairings, if you will. And something that I do when I go into an experience, because I do a lot of like evaluation types and looking at how the experience could be better, is I often see a mismatch between the design of that first position question or whatever it is and the expected second response. And that's really important because the response is what we then condition off of for the rest of the experience. If we can't get someone to stay on track with the conversation, we can't do anything with them. We can't help them achieve their goal, whatever their goal is, buying the item, and in Tim's case, you know, making a return. These are e-commerce examples, but you know, in all of our different contexts. So it's really important because you want to think about what kind of a response do I need from the user to then action off of. So maybe you do want a yes/no response because you want a simple A/B conditioning. That means you need to design that first part to prefer that kind of an answer. But maybe you want open-ended. Maybe you want a number, as we just talked about, and there's a way to design that initial question to produce a number as that second pair part. So looking at what happens in that first and second position, we as humans are very used to, I'll say this and then wait for the response. As builders and designers and engineers, we think about, what do I need in the second part? How do I design the first in order to get that?
I completely agree with Olivia because, especially about question structure, because at where I work and at a mental health app, it's a very sensitive context when a user onboards onto our chat and is talking to our bot. And in that moment, even though the bot is not a replacement for a therapist, we do use therapeutic techniques in terms of how we speak to users. And we do our best to keep it open ended and try to understand why the user is here before giving advice, before keeping it yes or no. Because with a yes or no question, we're not giving space for nuance, and we're already making an assumption that it's either or. And that's something we keep in mind of. And secondly, we think about how many questions we ask a user at the same time, because that can be very overwhelming and increase their cognitive load. And that can actually make the experience worse for a user, and they might leave our app feeling worse off, which is clinically unsafe. So it's the type of questions, how it's phrased, and how many, how often. Sometimes maybe they just want us to listen. That's also something we need to think of, like when do we want to ask them these questions? When do we want to probe them? When do we want to say, like, thanks for sharing? Do you want to take a break? Um, the context really matters, and yeah, the language is very important here.
How do you actually decide that kind of stuff with a conversational AI, like whether to listen more or prompt more? How do you decide what needs that kind of response?
So for each conversation, we have a purpose in mind. So do we want this to be a very open-ended conversation where the user can talk as long as they want, and we just keep engaging with them and probing and digging deeper? Or do we want the user to come to a resolution at the end, which is more of a tool? So one of the most known um, tools in psychology right now and in AI-based psychology is CBT, and we use CBT through chat right now. And there, it's about reframing your thought. So in that type of conversation, when the user enters, we set the context like, here's what we're going to be doing in this conversation. So there, we have the context that this is what this conversation will be about. And because we know as designers, the purpose is to come to a resolution and follow the principles of the CBT type tool, we design our questions and the purpose of our questions based on that.
Cool.
And just to
And
clarify,
maybe
for
just
people that
sorry,
yeah,
just to clarify, what is CBT, like in case somebody doesn't know?
CBT is cognitive behavioral therapy. It's a very well-known form of therapy right now, especially in the past 10 years. Kaine, if you would like to add on that.
Well, I mean, so CBT, the idea is basically helping people reorient their thoughts in a more positive direction. So they engage in particular behavior, and then often people have negative thoughts that come in when they engage in particular behaviors. And the idea is to help them stop, reframe, and think about it in a more positive way. So this is really important, I think, in if you're talking about health in a conversational AI context, because the AI can help people take that stop and reframe in a way that's very helpful to them. But if it's not helpful, if something has missed the mark, then it could potentially be harmful. So we have to be very in. We have to take a lot of additional data in order to make sure that we're picking up on nuanced cues that will help the patient or help the client um, make a positive step. And this is something that humans might do very well, but we really need to work on AI doing even more effectively, because AI doesn't know anything that we don't tell it, right? So we need to coach AI on a variety of different perspectives, a variety of different approaches to solving problems, and help it be more nuanced in the way that it responds to individuals. I mean, that customization is the key to I mean, is what makes AI magical, right? It can take in so much data, and the question is, what data do we feed it in order to make it respond the way we want to in context?
and how do you kind of or figure out like if someone's had a bad experience with kind of more of these open-ended conversations?
Well, whether, open-ended or not, I don't work in a healthcare context like Anandita does, but really we want to make sure we're drilling down into what is the goal of the interaction. What is the user actually trying to do? Usually there's a couple involved, but really drilling down at the beginning, what is the problem statement? What's the use case? What are the outcomes? I see a lot of temptation sometimes to just jump in and design a happy path for one particular thing. And that's great. But if it's just floating out there, it's really hard then when people do things that you don't expect them to do, as humans are wont to do. So if you start by looking at what's the problem statement, what are we actually solving for in this case, making sure you have that end state, and then working backwards from there is how I tend to think of it.
And then how do you measure success? Like, what does success look like? Because everyone is different, like the way they speak, the way they might perceive the interaction. So are there specific metrics that you measure? And how does that work?
For us on our side, it's pretty simple, which I'm very thankful about actually. Like at the end of the day, we're looking for a deal. So our main KPI that we're always after is like how many deals we're agreeing with people, how quickly are we agreeing stuff. The other real KPI that we look at is if we fail to agree a deal, we ask someone if they enjoyed the experience anyway. And that's kind of our best opportunity at getting feedback, which is a double-edged sword because we only ask for it when we get it wrong. But yeah.
Anyone else? Oh.
I can say in financial services, we're really interested in number of callbacks. So if customers are not having a positive experience with the conversational AI, they may end up reaching out to a customer services center to talk to a human. And if we see that we're getting a lot of pings off of the AI to a human, then that tells us that our AI is not actually solving the problem that they wanted to solve. And I mean, in financial services, sometimes that's just how it has to be. But I'm always very interested in how many problems can we actually solve that they don't actually really need a human for.
Right.
That problem solving perspective is so important because I work in a bunch of different verticals. So I'm always thinking resolution for whatever that use case is. What are we resolving for? What can we actually solve without a human or, minimal human involvement, depending on the case, particularly resolution over containment. Containment as an artificial measure of success doesn't do anything because there's a lot of things you can do to force someone to stay in a conversation unnecessarily. But that is we all know, obviously, that's a terrible experience. It's frustration on both parts. It's a waste of time. It's a waste of money. So resolution, which, sometimes might be an escalation to a human. Sometimes it might be some follow up with other folks. But again, thinking about what's the problem that we're solving and what's our resolution rate to that based on the design of the conversation.
Yeah, I think with this, it's pretty tricky. There's no one answer. It depends on the bot, depends on the purpose, like Olivia said. If it's a listening bot, do people drop off very easily? Or if they're dropping off, is it because they're refusing to talk, or is it just that they're done with the conversation? So qualitative user feedback is important. Is it also about is it clinically safe, the conversation? That is evaluated by our clinical team. So there are different checks that we have to be like, what is a successful bot? What is a safe bot? And that really varies upon the use case.
And like moving this topic to like a different direction, because I feel like with success you could also like encounter different definitions of success, like even within the same bot in some way, of like what is the best experience for each customer in a way. I'm curious to bring it a little bit back on cognitive science and like behavior patterns. If you do notice like specific behavior patterns being associated with like certain, I don't know, cohorts or like groups of users, and if you notice that certain behaviors or certain designs work better based on the type of user. Maybe Tim, if you have any experience with this.
This one, I mean, it's tricky for me to answer in detail because we try and treat every shopper anonymously. We don't collect like customer data, so we don't have information about like their age or demographics like that. Yeah, it's actually a tricky one for me to get into, honestly.
Okay.
I can give you an example
Sure.
from financial services. So often the people who are developing conversational AI in financial services come from relatively financially secure backgrounds. When you work in artificial intelligence in Silicon Valley, where I do, you know, these are people who are comfortable with money, used to having money, have money in a savings account, and yet when you turn around and you're dealing with customers, you have people who are using things like overdraft protection as a way to make sure they can buy groceries for their children. And we don't think about those issues. If it's not part of your experience, you may not be thinking about how do I design experiences that address a totally different level of financial concern. If it's not a level of financial concern that you never have to deal with. And so I think focusing deeply on the broad range of customers and moving yourself out of that perspective where everybody's like me, which is it's really easy to fall into. Finding that and bringing that into your experience can make things much more positive and give you a much broader range of customer satisfaction, which, but it's so hard to move yourself out of your frame of reference. Like, I've never thought that I might need to use overdraft protection to buy groceries for my children. If you've never thought about that, then you're missing a huge swath of the customers that you're serving. So it's always important to kind of get out of your own head and move into that space.
And do you have like any ways of doing this exercise of like pulling back and thinking about how do you know what you don't know type of thinking?
Well, I mean, one of the things I do on a regular basis is listen to customer calls with actual human agents and trying to scrape out of that, like, what is the part of this I didn't understand? What is the part of this that I didn't know how to explain? What is the phrasing that customers are using to let me know that they are coming from this point of view? And then bringing that back to my product team and saying, here are the things we need to reintroduce into our conversations because we're thinking about this from a place of privilege that we might need to back up from, because our customers just don't all have that same privilege, and we can't design our conversations from that perspective of, well, obviously you're going to use overdraft protection only in a freak accident where you need to avoid like not spending money. But here, I mean, I've genuinely listened to hundreds of conversations where people are coming from a completely different place in context, a completely different place in society. And I feel like we have a moral obligation to make sure that our super advanced conversational AI is serving everyone, not just those who come from our perspective.
Well, Kaine, your point about going to the data is so key. That's, my team kind of laughs at me that I always say, well, what's the data say? We don't have to guess at what humans want to do. They will tell us. They'll tell us very clearly what they're trying to make happen. Whether you're listening to like actual live agents or you're looking at transcripts or audio files of your bot or your agent, but also get creative with how you look for data. There are, I'm sure we've probably seen with the increase in AI at the drive-through, people post TikToks and other reels about their interactions with AI at the drive-through, and watching those, you can glean insights about, oh, I didn't even think about this in my user testing, but this is what people are asking for. Looking at, getting creative with where you're getting your data from, so you can try and get out of that silo as much as possible. And then I'm just seeing a few things coming up in the chat. Having this relate to inclusive design, I think, makes perfect sense, because when you're thinking about users who aren't you or don't come from your perspective, being intentional about designing in a way that is effective for all users is going to make the experience better overall.
Yeah, to just add on that, I think when we make inferences, sometimes that leads to assumptions. And an example of that was, especially with mental health and AI, a lot of people have concerns about privacy and, where's our data going and all that. But I had to attend an event where I was trying to get user insights with a colleague. And it was a well-being event. One of our clients hosted it. So we had like a stall there to talk to people who probably have used our app. And a lot of people did not ask any questions about the data. They just asked, will we be understood? And I think we overestimated how people are concerned about the AI and the data and all of that, when these people were working in a big company. Probably a lot of them were already software engineers or like machine learning engineers who already knew all this stuff, like the basics. So I think what is stigmatized and what is concerning is very different to different types of people. And if there was a clinician on this call, they would have a lot of different questions for me. So I think, yeah, not everything that is a concern for everybody.
Yeah, so I think Melanie had a great comment. So what I'm hearing, there will always be a need for humans in the loop to train, to monitor, to test, to recalibrate, and to determine success. So I'm curious, like, what are the biggest challenges with using behavioral science to influence behavior change?
Doing it ethically, period. We know how to manipulate people.
Mm-hmm.
What we need to be doing with behavioral science in our conversational design is helping people. And that's not always what we think it is.
Where do you draw that line, or like how does that line get determined? I know it's like dependent on the experience, the people. Like, how do we kind of like figure out how to scope that out? I know that's a loaded question, but
What's the use case? What's the problem statement? Can you drill it down to one sentence to be kind of your North Star in building an experience? Because when you get deep into the weeds on some of these things, it can be kind of easy to forget sometimes, like, why are we actually building this? What problem are we solving? So I do try and write down literally a one sentence. What's the problem? What's our solution? As that, North Star that you can use as a touch point. Like, is this still serving what I'm doing here?
Mm-hmm. Anyone else?
I would say, working in industry, one of the key questions is my response a moral response? In that, am I leading my client or my customer to a solution that's really good for them, or is it just one that's good for my company?
Mm-hmm.
And I will always go for the one that's good for them.
Yeah, absolutely.
But-
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I just like kind of had a follow up on this of like, I'm wondering, because like I feel like it's often the case that like designers are like pushing for the ethical outcome, but like what if there comes like a bad designer who isn't doing their job of like not pushing for this like moral guidelines and like keeping it ethical, the way we manipulate customers, like to keep them on the happy path and not to like drive something towards the business? Like, is there like something like a way for, say, someone who isn't a designer, who's like the leader of designers, that maybe doesn't like have a hands-on approach on this, to know how do we prevent people from like going in this direction of like being too like metric driven and not looking out for the customer? if you have any suggestion at all on this.
I mean, it's about being strategic with your metrics and your KPIs and not artificially saying, oh, well, it's containment. Oh, it's this, it's XYZ, it's, these dollars. It's about understanding your experience and setting up your KPIs that are, as Tim has talked about, a win-win. It's a win for the company. It's a win for your stakeholders. It's a win for the user and the person who's experiencing this. And that is certainly possible, but it does take a little bit more effort and strategy to determine KPIs that are a win-win for all parties versus artificially saying it's containment or some other metric that may or may not make sense for that particular context.
So I'm curious, this may be a little bit more of a broader question, but is there like a specific amount of time it usually takes to like see behavior change when you're trying to nudge people in the right direction versus, I guess, when they're motivated to change on their own?
I mean, who is motivated to change on their own, right? Like,
exactly.
I think it's especially in conversational AI, if we don't take the lead in conversations, we just see the same result over and over again. But in terms of how long it takes to start to see change, it's very dependent for us on what we're trying to change, and we just monitor it via A/B tests. And sometimes it will take, a few weeks. Other times it's months, and we still don't have any significant result there.
Mm-hmm.
On the flip side, I've seen change in a matter of hours, depending on the cohort, and depending on the volume of data that you're dealing with. If it's an experience that thousands and thousands of people are interacting with, I can publish a change, wait for the next cohort, see the change from cohort A to B in a matter of hours or days sometimes. But it also, again, it depends on what that goal is and the volume that you're dealing with. But this can happen very quickly, which as a scientist, that's so fun to see what change you put in and then get those results that quickly.
So for those types of changes, like, are you changing specific words that you're using, or like, is there any other thing within the conversation that you can kind of play with?
Yeah, generally I'm thinking structurally what's going on, what kind of, if I see that, I've designed my first part to elicit some sort of second part and I looked at the data and 90% of answers are doing something else than I expected. I think, oh, well, is that what people are actually trying to use this for? Can I adjust my questions so we don't have to do so many follow-up questions? Like, how can I make it make sense to what they're using? Because we want to be as data-driven as possible with this, right? And we can look at the science and what the science shows. Science is always being continually updated. That's the beauty of it. So when you have new data and you see evidence for something, I then take that and go and tweak what's happening so that we are being data driven and we're being cutting edge in what we're doing. And now we're not insisting that just because I thought of an idea a month ago, that's what we have to stick with. You want to be humble enough to be open to your data and open to your users and see what they can teach you as well.
Anyone else have?
I was just going to say that's especially important when it comes to language because people use language in so many different ways. And so being sensitive to how a wide range of clients or customers are using language to communicate their ideas and then being responsive to that. So, Olivia, I'm so yes, I 100% agree.
Yeah, I think with language in mental health and like if it's a tool, like we mentioned CBT, very tricky to talk about change and behavioral change. It's a journey. People go back and forth. Some people find it overwhelming. They take a break. So that's a bit tricky. But we do look at language, and we try not to assume that all the users know what CBT is and what the terms mean. So in terms of change, I guess I don't have a direct answer right now, but that's a little more like it's not just design, it's also design and clinical in my experience.
I'll also say that we often think about in business, we think about changes, we need them to happen quickly. But human behavioral change doesn't happen like that in most cases. So we need to be ready to accept that change, if you want it to be permanent or long standing, you need to build it slowly, right? You need to get people to move towards the direction you want in a slow pace, because fast change doesn't stick. Slow change sticks because it's only a tiny piece of change every bit. So, we push for fast because we think fast is going to bring profit or success, but really we know from studying behavioral science that the best change, the strongest change that's not going to fail long term is that slow, patient progress. And that's tricky to do when you've got people saying, tell me what the KPIs are right now and how are we moving forward. And I think that's where behavioral science, and we're talking about behavioral science in the context of conversational AI, is very important, because we need to let them know, I understand you want things to happen now, but if they happen now, they're going to disappear tomorrow, and we're going to have to rebuild them every single time.
To take it like really broad strokes, I think we're in a really interesting moment in the field historically, because there's a lot of distrust and suspicion of chatbots and artificial agents, and a lot of assumptions that they can't solve problems, they can't do what users need, they are nefarious, or that they're limited to things like picking your next song, versus solving, maybe slightly more crucial problems for users. And that's something I just came up across. I was working and building an experience, and the data that was coming in early on, folks were saying, oh gosh, this is a robot, it's not going to work, like just get me to a human, please, right away, before even giving a chance. So then I designed a series of follow-up questions that were empathetic to the user's potential frustration or concern that it wasn't going to work, extracted the data and the answers that I need, presented a solution, and then showed that resolution rate from folks who came into the conversation saying, literally, I can hear the audio saying, oh gosh, it's a robot, like I don't want to deal with this, to the end saying, oh, wait, that actually worked, or this works, or hey, like that's why we want to look at, again, the data and what they're doing, but there's ways of nudging along, guiding them along. But again, drawing on the data, seeing that. But I do think, historically, we're at a really interesting moment where we're pushing back against a lot of assumptions on what these things can or should do, both from the broader business perspective as well as the users themselves.
I'm so curious, Olivia, have you noticed that negative, like, oh, this is a bot, do you think that's gone up since, like, in the past couple of years of generative AI? Because in my what I see is the extremes have just gotten more extreme, and I see a split of people who say, oh, this is a bot more, but also I see more people having more trust in bots, almost too much sometimes, but more optimistic about what they can do and what they can achieve. I'm so curious if you're seeing it more negative.
I think it's both, which is the classic example, but I think there's also a challenge in over-indexing on what the bot can do, because the public has become so much more familiar via things like ChatGPT and have a lot more trust in a lot of ways, which is great. But then sometimes if we're not honest about what a bot can or should do, and we start off saying, this is going to be an extreme example, but if we start off effectively saying, I can solve anything for you in this context, when in reality, we could only do A, B, and C, and we just promised them all the way through X, Y, and Z, users are going to get super frustrated super quickly, and that over time erodes that trust that we're trying to build. So it's not a bad thing to be honest about what the capabilities are, and that comes to, again, the use case, the problem statement, and I think being honest up front about what the bot can actually do, because as users see that that's indeed true and truthful, that builds trust in your company and your brand and keeps people wanting to come back to this channel versus any other channel.
Yeah, that's something that we do as well, especially in our mental health conversations, because there are certain things that are very sensitive and that only humans can handle. So we do have parts of the conversation where we do say, like, hey, as a bot, we can't handle these type of things, but these are some resources you can reach out to. You can come back and we can try these tools together to support your support outside of this. So, and that kind of helps build trust as opposed to just BSing your way through it or being like, I can't help you at all.
I think there are also generational differences we need to be thoughtful about. When I'm working on an experience, I always think, okay, so I have a 90-year-old mother who thinks tech is dubious and can only do certain things. I have a 24-year-old Gen Z kid who has grown up on the internet. Right? I mean, she had a web page when she was like 3 days old or something crazy like that. Well, that was me. But anyway, so I mean, we also have to think about like what are the expectations of the technology across different generations, and we need to design so that we're grabbing each person at the place where they are and leading them into the right path. And that's really challenging if we're coming at it from a particular generational perspective or a particular understanding of technology. So um, I I keep trying to emphasize this as clearly the oldest person on this panel. That you need to talk to the old people because we have different understanding about how things work, but also understanding that perspective on each end. These are all people using conversational AI, and we can't think that they talk to a machine in the same way, and that's really tricky.
Yeah.
I
Absolutely.
totally agree with something Melanie just put in the chat about how she doesn't know why some companies think that being clear about what your bot can and cannot do takes away from the magic of the chatbot. Because actually, at the end of the day, you're just setting expectations that way. And I think it goes a step towards, like Olivia was saying, transparency if you're using behavioral science. Like, if you're clear about what you want to do, then it's obvious you're using behavioral science to achieve that outcome and that outcome alone. Like, yeah, it's all about being transparent.
Are there any other like ways that people can go about as designers or as people creating these experiences to make sure they're like being ethical about how stuff is being presented to users?
I feel like this is a toss into my wheelhouse.
Yes.
I will say that in the military they say you're supposed to follow orders, but you shouldn't follow it on an ethical order. And I think that that's also true in conversational AI. There are many company policies that are designed to benefit shareholders and not designed to benefit customers. And I think it's always the most important thing we do is to design experience that are good for our customers and the company can deal with it. Because if we're not treating our customers ethically, then what are we doing?
I guess as a follow-up to that, are there any situations where we shouldn't be using behavioral science in conversational AI?
I think again, it's what's that end goal? What's the end state? And if it is to make the experience better, more seamless, get that outcome for the user that's going to make their life easier, absolutely, we should use every single tool at our disposal to make that experience as naturalistic, seamless, and frustration-free as possible. But again, it's not about the one line that you're tweaking with. Of course, that's going to have impacts and things, but it's about what is the overall experience? What is your goal in this? Why are you asking these questions? What are you doing with the information? What are you doing with the data? If you have a solid understanding of the overarching purpose, yeah, that's the fun part. Then play away in the designs. Like that's what we have a lot of fun with. At least, I see the smiles that all of us do in our day to day, but making sure that again, we have a broad understanding and we're on the same page and we're creating win-win situations for the company, the stakeholders, the users, then carry on with every way that we want to make that happen and achieve that goal.
Anyone else?
I would say the only time you don't want to use behavioral science is if you're not actually wanting to deal with people. And I would think 100% what we're trying to do is create a conversational experience that feels like they're talking with someone who cares about them.
Mhm.
And whatever you can do to make them feel that you care about them and to genuinely deliver on the goals that they have, that's great. If you're trying to manipulate them in a way that benefits you but doesn't actually benefit them, then no, like just stop. that's the wrong choice. But as long as you're doing it to make customers feel comfortable and genuinely deliver to them the kind of experiences that will help them, no, there are no limits. Just like you wouldn't say, "Oh, I want you to stop caring about other people." You wouldn't say that as a person. So as long as your AI is genuinely caring, no. If it's manipulating, kind of harming people, bringing them to a place that will benefit me but not them, yeah, that's where you need to stop.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, like we've been talking about like maybe some meta level questions on like when to use it, how to use it, whatever. But like to get more into the fun of it, of like what is behavioral science and like what are things we could use. Do you have any like concepts or like techniques that you really like, or maybe like one favorite concept that you'd like to highlight and that might be especially relevant for people working in conversational AI?
One shout out I would definitely give is to our senior advisor's TED Talks. If you YouTube, his name is Nero Sivanathan. I don't know if I can put it I'll put it in the comments later. But if you YouTube the dilation effect, he has a great 15-minute TED Talk on this concept about how the more points you put into an argument, the weaker your strongest point is. So essentially, the more you talk, the less you're getting anywhere. It's a great, great talk, so I'd recommend anyone check it out. And it's useful not only for conversational AI, but in daily life as well.
I mean, I mentioned preference structure at the beginning of the webinar, sequence structure, all these things that come out of conversation analysis. This is a rather academic suggestion, but Rebecca Clift wrote a book, Conversation Analysis. It's a textbook, but it's pretty approachable. I think I've recommended it to a few folks who are interested in seeing a little bit more nuts and bolts. What does this actually mean on a turn-by-turn mechanism? So that should hopefully be approachable enough for people.
Go ahead. We do have a question from Melanie. Can any of you share the worst use case you've ever seen? Does anyone have any they can share?
Is that the worst use case of like behavioral science being used in a bot? Because I mean, it feels quite nice that nothing jumps to mind for me immediately. Like we've obviously all seen bad bots, but in terms of misleading behavioral science techniques and things like that, I think we're quite lucky that our field is led by people like us who are kind of championing the ethics behind it all. At least that's my viewpoint.
Anyone else?
I mean, I think in general, poor use cases and poor experiences and ultimately poor CSAT and all the rest is when you come in with one expectation and you maybe are told that this is something that a bot can do, and then you find out 3-4 steps down the line, it can't do that at all. And you feel completely stuck because it's asking you question after question after question. You can tell you're not getting anywhere. It's really akin to, if you think of like an old school IVR system where you call in, you're like, okay, I press 1, I press 2, and I press 3, and I press 4. We don't want to make folks stuck where they are. We want to understand, again, what they're actually trying to do and get them to that information and that solution that they need.
I think the worst use case I ever saw was one that led customers through, I think, 5 different screens, and then the answer that they wanted was embedded in a 13-page PDF.
Oh no.
And I'm just like, because the lawyers were all focused on like, we have to make sure all the language is available. And I just thought, no one wants to look through a 13-page PDF to find the answer that they want. Like,
Yeah.
it's our job to pull all. I mean, it was the laziest solution I had ever seen, and it just made me cringe. But and so our job is to figure out how do we pull all the information out and make that available to customers, turn by turn so that they can get exactly what they want. No customer should ever have to read a 13-page PDF. And again, I work in financial services, so there are lots of pages of legal documents, but that's just insane. Like, you never make a customer do something like that. And I can't imagine any customer thinking that was a reasonable solution.
Oh gosh. Yeah.
It was the worst. I literally screamed about that at meetings for like a year.
Oh no. So we do have another going back to trust. So on the topic of engendering trust, transparency, and making users feel comfortable, do you build a bot that feels more human conversationally, or that feels more like a bot, and why?
I can
Anandita?
speak a lot on this because in
Yeah, go for it.
building trust and getting people to open up and even try something out for their own well-being, it's very tricky. And what people trust really varies across cultures. In cultures like India and like similar collectivistic cultures, like authoritative figures and like hierarchies are still very respected and valued. So when there's any sort of advice or like suggestions given for well-being, it that can make a difference for somebody who comes from that kind of background. But right now for our B2C app, we focus on like a peer level tone. So the way we write and the language we use is very like, hey, I'm a buddy here to support you through your journey, as opposed to I'm your therapist or I'm an authoritative figure or a clinician who knows so much and is like giving you advice when it's not about advice. So the language we use is very like friendly, peer, simple, and the tone and sometimes banter also matters to make it relatable. So in my use case, that really makes like the world of a difference. And our bot has a personality and the way we write and a tone, and we specifically train our team on that. So.
And I'm going to say, kind of piggybacking off of that, the question of, is it conversational? Is it a bot? It's both. I think you can be natural conversation. You can make it like talking to another human and also be honest that it's an automation. And these two things are, for me, they're not in direct conflict. I think actually the best experiences are where, again, you are clear about the use case, you understand your problem statement, you are being transparent about the fact that it is a bot. You're not trying to pretend that it's a human, because people are really smart and they see through that really fast, and that really erodes trust, I think, when we try and pretend that it's actually a human. So you can have both. It can be a bot and you can be honest about that, and it can be an amazing natural conversational experience.
Yeah, 1,000%. We take the same approach as well, so definitely agree with that. And what you were saying, Anandita, about the cultural differences, like we find that we tweak our persona depending on where in the world we're launching with a client, because if we're negotiating in America, where negotiation is not as culturally like accepted, we take a softer approach and our persona is different than if we negotiate in an Indian store where people expect to be able to negotiate from the get-go, and if they can't, it's odd. And we're much more blunt there because it actually builds more trust if we're much more direct and upfront than if we're softer about it. But in both cases, we're talking human and conversationally, but being very clear that we're a chatbot. Yeah.
Kaine, any thoughts to add?
No, I think I've talked enough. I'm gonna sit back for a second.
So we have another question from Melody, and then we'll I know we're getting close to time, so we'll wrap up after this. What are your thoughts on hyper-realistic digital humans in the behavioral space? Anyone want to?
Kind of terrifying. And I think it's the kind of thing that like is calling out to be regulated more, and the kind of stuff that you have to be clear that you are not a human and things like that. But I think, unfortunately, regulation is probably going to lag behind the rest of it the same way it did for like social media. Regulation didn't come fast enough. And I think it's down to people working in this to make sure it's ethical. I am kind of nervous about that, honestly. Yeah,
Well, when you say hyper-realistic, what reality are you talking about? If you live in the United States, you're aware that there are multiple realities that exist simultaneously about like how the world works and how politics work and how everything is happening. You have to be incredibly thoughtful about how you curate the data you're feeding to your AI to help it understand how human beings want to interact. I have zero problem with hyperrealistic AI. I just want to know that it's actually based in reality, not in an alternate political fantasy. And that's really hard to do if you're just grabbing huge amounts of data from the interwebs or whatever else and feeding it into an AI and saying, hey, this is how people act. Not all people's behavior is worth replicating. And we need to be thoughtful about that.
I love, Shelby, what you just called out in the comments, humane, but not human. That these things can coexist at the same time. Like Kaine, what you just said, that, you know, hyper realistic, great, but which reality and based on which data? And same thing, conversational and a bot at the same time. But it's hard to hold multiple truths at the same time. It takes a lot of nuance. It takes a lot of thought in your strategy and your design thinking in order to do so.
Yes, but that is at the core what being human is, holding multiple truths in your head. Sometimes, I mean, cognitive dissonance is a thing. Should AI have cognitive dissonance, or is it supposed to just be totally focused on a particular line?
That is a good question to leave us all pondering here, I think.
I guess the last thing we'll close out with then is, do you have any advice for people trying to implement behavioral science into conversational AI experiences, or any resources or any tips to help them do it the right way?
Look at your data. You don't have to guess what humans are going to do. You can look in the data and see what they're actually doing and be grounded in that. And that, as a first pass, helps you get out of your own head and your own assumptions about how something should or shouldn't operate when you look at the actual data and see what people are actually doing.
I would say curate your data. Think carefully about what you're teaching your AI to do and what values you're giving your AI. Everybody's data isn't worth replicating. And it's worth being thoughtful about it to get customers to their goal without engaging in morally questionable behavior.
I think I just
and then
add.
don't lose track of your end goal, your bot's use case that you're aiming for. Make sure that what you're doing is all for the purpose of kind of helping you get there, but in a way that is not going to deceive or trick your end customer.
Yeah, I think lastly, I just say learn how to ask good questions. Make sure they're not leading and just reinforcing what you think a user might say or you assume a certain group of people might respond with. So that shapes your responses and the data that you get.
That's a really good one. Well, we're at time. So thank you so much, everyone, for being here. This was super insightful, and I learned a lot from all of you. So this is our last panel discussion for the season. So we'll be back in the fall with more. So yeah, stay tuned. And we have some exciting things coming up. So we'll share those soon.
Yeah, so don't wait until the fall because maybe there will be news during the summer already from us.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, both of you, for organizing this.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes, thank you,
What a
everyone.
fantastic panel.
Yeah.
This was really
Great.
fun.
Thank you so much,
Thank you.
everyone. Bye.
Good night.
Bye.
Thanks,
Thank
guys.
you.
Bye.